crossing one with the science fiction motif. And Bioshock. I'd say that Bioshock, even though a lot of people typically call it a science fiction game, is still very much horror because of those emotions that it conjures up while you're playing it, about dread and fearing what's around the next corner. So survival horror is kind of a weird genre to work in because it's full of these kind of contradictions. Video games usually, for most people, provide some kind of wish fulfillment and their escapism. You know, even if you're going off to an alien world to fight aliens, it's still something cool. You want to fly in those spaceships, you want to wear that power armor, you want to run around with that gun, and it's fun, and it's fun to role play being that character. Same thing can be said of the fantasy genre, even the crime genre. Playing as a mafia gangster is still, kind of living out that fantasy. Video games are providing the wish fulfillment and escapism, but survival horror is actually about putting you in horrible situations, putting you places that no sane person would ever really choose to go to. It's actually what I call nightmare fulfillment. So, wish fulfillment for most games. For survival horror games, it's about nightmare fulfillment. Taking those nightmares that you wake up from in the middle of your sleep, drenched in sweat, thinking, God, it was just a dream. I'm going to go open my PlayStation and throw in a game and have that exact same experience again. It's the players that want to do survival horror are actually kind of masochists. I think there's some little part of them that likes to torture themselves. So video games, as we said, are really empowering. They give you huge guns, huge spaceships. It's usually one guy fighting against massive armies of bad guys. And a key difference is they usually save the day. Think about most genres. Think about like the Call of Duty games, for instance. You're facing overwhelming odds. You're put into a war situation, and it's horrible, and it's horrifying and terrifying, but you still prevail, right? At the end of that, you are a soldier that saves the world from destruction. In most survival horror games, winning just means you got out alive. Most survival horror games don't have you saving the world or even saving the girl. Usually, success is measured by just getting out alive. So, survival horror is really about disempowering the player. It's about taking away all those things that make you feel really secure in other genres. So it means you're not going to have the huge BFG gun. You're not going to have the missile launcher. You're not going to have a ton of squad mates running around calling down fire and thunder from above. It's about making the player feel particularly vulnerable. And actually, just to touch on for a second, the idea of being vulnerable. Think about a lot of the tropes. Some of the cliche things about horror. If you think about horror movies, how many times have we seen scenes involving a baby crying? Or like baby monitors or video cameras of babies. Think about how many scenes you've seen in horror movies that involve a character being in the shower or swimming in a lake. We have a lot of scenes in horror movies where a character is naked, right, or partially nude. Why is that? It's because in all of those situations you're dealing with characters who are extremely vulnerable. Okay, children are vulnerable. You feel really vulnerable when you're in the shower or when you're swimming in the ocean. So vulnerability is really a key tenet of horror, and it's definitely what we're trying to do with survival horror. We want the player to feel vulnerable. The weird thing is, if you look at the evolution of survival horror games, is that basically they are broken action games. My producer, associate producer Tom Hullett at Konami, we were discussing this the other day, and he pointed this out. He said, the earliest survival horror games were just broken action games. And when I say broken, that may sound like kind of a sacrilege to maybe some of the hardcore Silent Hill fans, but if you think about things like Silent Hill 1 and Silent Hill 2, really poor camera, very poor camera control. Very poor controls is what we call the tank controls, right? It was damn hard to get that character just to navigate the simple environment, to go from one door down a hallway and into the next room. Extremely hard. Poor interfaces. A lot of the early survival horror games were very heavily involved with inventory, so you had to manage an inventory screen, you had to manage combining different items, going to a completely different screen to see how many bullets you had left in your gun, things like that. So those early survival games actually had poor cameras, poor controls, poor interfaces, and that's part of what made them so damn scary. Because when you were in Silent Hill 2 and you were in a room and suddenly the monsters are chasing you, part of the stress that you put the player in was just trying to get your character far enough away from the monster. In a first-person shooter, usually that wouldn't be a big issue. You'd just be able to navigate and run to the next room and grab a gun. So that's something that a lot of the fans some of the more savvy fans pick up on this when you watch the Silent Hill fan boards, but a lot of them are just like, oh, Silent Hill 2 was so scary. Well, there's a reason. At least that's part of the reason why Silent Hill 2 was so scary. Now, what happened was action games evolved. So our interface and our controls actually improved greatly. We, as developers, we got better at doing things like third-person cameras, first-person cameras. I remember playing the earliest first-person shooters with mouse and keyboard, and I thought, there is no way I'm ever going to play a first-person shooter on a console. I just can't imagine doing this type of motion and this type of interface on a console. But we've perfected that. So we keep making these advances in game development. So our interface has become really streamlined and minimalist. We end up having much smarter ways of dealing with inventory screens. We have really intuitive cameras where if the player is sitting there playing with your camera in the video game, typically that means that your camera might not be as good as it should be. Typically you want a player to not have to worry about where his camera is pointed because the camera should be smart enough to do it for him. So the rest of game development kind of moved on, but these same advances, when we applied them to horror games, actually kind of broke some of those horror games. When you give the player really good cameras and really good inventory, good interfaces and such, you're empowering him again, and you're then making him less vulnerable. So what happened was the fans of the genre lose those elements that drew them to the survival horror in the first place. I'll just give you a very quick example. Clive Barker's Jericho, a game that I was extremely close to. The problem with Jericho was we took a lot of the things that would make a survival horror game, and we threw them out. We ended up making you really empowered. You weren't just a lone guy trying to survive. You were a super soldier that had not just advanced weaponry and technology, you also had magic. So you were also a supernatural badass, besides just being a regular badass. You weren't alone. You actually had 6 other friends with you. So suddenly that solitary, I'm alone and something's going to eat me, we lost that because we had 6 other friends sitting there going, don't worry, I'll watch your back. The exploration element that people loved about survival horror games, we totally lost in Jericho. We ended up making the game extremely linear. We were trying to make it easy for mainstream players that don't have that same patience for exploring a map. So we tried to make the game much more linear and not require as much exploration, and it turns out people hated that. They didn't like being funneled through basically a spook house with monsters jumping out at them. We also we tried to overwhelm the players, so we said, okay, we need to make them feel vulnerable, so we'll give them lots of enemies charging at them and fighting with them. The problem is, we made those enemies unvanquishable. You could kill them, but it was really, really difficult to kill them. And it's a really fine line that you're trying to balance. So you're trying to make the player feel vulnerable and panicked, but then you cross a line where it goes from like, oh wow, this game's really stressful, to becoming what gamers call Nintendo hard. Okay, it becomes a frustrating game. You end up throwing the controller and you don't ever want to see the thing again. Basically what I'm saying is if you start taking away a lot of those key elements of like the survival horror genre, what you're going to end up with is something that kind of looks like a horror game, but it doesn't play anything like it. You're not going to get the same emotional responses from the player, or at least not the emotions you're trying to get, and the game's not going to be a success. So when we started working at Vatra on Silent Hill, when I was first brought into the team, first thing that I wanted to figure out is, okay, I've worked on a lot of horror games before. Not all of them have been particularly successful. What lessons did we learn? And one of the first things I wanted to look at is, what are players afraid of? Okay? All of us in here are probably game players ourselves. So what are the basic fears of a player? Well, simple. 1, losing the game. Okay? Nobody wants to lose the game. Losing your progress is probably more specific to the problem. You don't want to lose your progress. So a lot of games add that tension in by just putting the save point, the next save point, just far enough away to make it really hard to get to. Being unprepared for the next challenge. That's a really big one that players are afraid of. And I think this is one of the key elements of survival horror. It's that moment when you first see the monster walk onto the screen. You're feeling pretty cocky because you've killed the last few monsters you've encountered. You're feeling good about yourself. You go into the next room, and then something drops off the ceiling and starts skulking towards you. And you think, shit, I have no idea what I'm supposed to do to fight that thing. So it's that feeling of being totally unprepared. It's the same feeling when you have those nightmares where you wake up and you remember that the test is that morning and you didn't study at all. It's that same panic that you're not prepared. Another fear of players, when we looked at the forums and we looked at what the Silent Hill fans were saying about the game, we were able to deduce that they're afraid of surrendering or submitting to the mercy of the game designers. And that could be good or it could be bad. A bad implementation of that is when you feel like you're being funneled and forced down a path, you're not being given the exploration, and you're kind of being toyed with. But the good side of that, of surrendering and submitting, is what Konami calls the scare rooms. Okay, a lot of Silent Hill games have the scare rooms where there's the one in particular where, correct me if I'm wrong, I think it was in 3. I think it's when Heather comes into a room and there's mirrors around her, and she sees a reflection of herself, and blood starts appearing on her reflection. It starts appearing in the room. Nothing happens to you as a player. You don't die, you don't get killed, no monsters come in and grab you. Nothing bad actually happens to you. But for that little moment, weird things are happening. You're completely trapped in this room, and at that moment, you are completely at the mercy of the game designer. Whatever they're going to throw at you next, you're stuck. There's nothing you can do to break out of it. And players of the Silent Hill franchise in particular seem to really like that moment of having to submit suddenly to the greater powers of the game and ride out whatever's going to happen to them. So Silent Hill. What do we do with Silent Hill? Well, as you probably know, it's a game with a really long legacy. We can't tell you what the title is of the new one, so we're just calling it Silent Hill 8. But that tells you there's been 7 previous iterations of it. The first one came out in 1999 on PlayStation 1. Silent Hill 2, which is by many fans considered the best one, came out a couple years later for PlayStation 2. Then followed by Silent Hill 3. Those first 3 ones are the ones that the fans of the series all seem to harken back to and say that was like the golden period of Silent Hill. Then they did Silent Hill 4: The Room. It was a huge departure away from some of the tenets of the license, which we're going to look at in a moment and find out what are those core ideas of Silent Hill. Silent Hill 4 was the first one that broke away from those core ideas, and as such, it's really considered one of the worst Silent Hill games. A lot of fans don't like that one. Incidentally, that game wasn't created to be a Silent Hill game. It was actually a completely different game with a different developer that Konami ended up saying, hey, this could actually make a good Silent Hill game, and it'll be a cool way to evolve the franchise. But it turned out players didn't want the franchise to evolve. Next, you had Silent Hill Origins on the handheld PlayStation Portable. Silent Hill Homecoming was another one of those radical departures. So with that one, they kind of made some of the mistakes that we made on Jericho. They empowered the player too much. It was more of like a shooter. It was very combat heavy. It was very combat focused. You played a soldier. Okay, so again, instead of being, Joe Nobody from just some small town that gets caught up in this horrible situation, instead you were a soldier that comes home. So even though he was like a kind of normal guy, he wasn't like action hero soldier. We still know soldiers are badasses. He knows how to use a gun. He probably knows how to kill you a bunch of different ways just using his hands. So already we're feeling a bit more empowered. The camera was a much more traditional game camera. So the player was in much more control of the camera. And it was very much about shooting. It was very much about combat. It wasn't a bad game, at least in my opinion, and a lot of reviewers' opinions. It actually didn't review particularly poorly. It was a good game. It had good gameplay. But it was such a radical departure from Silent Hill that the fans just revolted. And then the last installment, the Wii-only version, was Shattered Memories. So in that one, they swung that pendulum way from the other direction. So Homecoming